share my screen with you. And you should see my messy screen here. So let's play this. Okay, so the blood circulatory system, also known as the cardiovascular system, comprises of your blood vessels and heart, and all of your what's in the blood, so all of your blood cells, which we're going to go through in a second. So the point of this system is really for transportation. It moves stuff around the body, so it's a bit like the road network of the country, really. It's got large roads that go to like the main cities, which would be the organs, and then you have smaller roads, and even smaller roads going to all the different places in that city that people need to get to. So those will be your smaller blood vessels and your capillaries. So it comprises of, as I said, blood vessels and the heart, and provides the fluid environment for the body. The fluid part of it is the blood, which is a connective tissue. And then we have within, so the blood is held within blood vessels, which are basically tubes that go to and from the heart and to and from everywhere else in the body. And the heart is a pump. That's all it is. It's a really highly muscular organ. It's got a special muscle tissue, which is called cardiac muscle tissue, which is only found in the heart. And it never stops beating, because if it stops, then you stop, basically. So there's no sort of heart stopping and you being okay. So let's talk a little bit about blood. Blood is comprised of 55% straw-coloured fluid, and this fluid is called plasma. It looks a little bit like apple juice, and then the rest of it is made, 45% is made up of cells. So there are three main types of blood cell. We have red blood cells, which are erythrocytes, white blood cells, which are leukocytes, and then platelets, which are thrombocytes. So I'm going to go through what each of those do. So let's start with red blood cells. So red blood cells are the most numerous of all the blood cells in the in the blood. Red blood cells are why blood is red. So that's what gives it its colour. They are really specialised cells that have no nucleus, and the cytoplasm, that's the jelly-like fluid inside the cell, is filled with something called hemoglobin, and that is specialised to just carry oxygen, so it doesn't have anything else inside of it apart from this hemoglobin. So they just float around carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide from one place to another. So in the shape is quite important for their function. I won't go too much into that now because it's not really needed for level 2, but the shape is biconcave. So concave, do you remember concaved and convexed from school? No, does anybody remember concave, the words concaved and convex, or have any idea what they might mean?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. Everybody loved science in school then, I can tell. Right, so concaved means that it's dented in, and convex is that it's sort of bulging out a little bit. So when you have a red blood cell in front of you, it looks a little bit like a refresher. So does everybody know what I mean by a refresher? The sweet.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's got a little dip on one side and another little dip on the other, and it's round. So that's basically what a red blood cell looks like. So they have a specialist membrane. It's a semi-permeable membrane. You might remember that from school, but you might not. So that means that semi-permeable membranes mean that they let things in and out of the cell, really. So the wall lets things in and out, but selectively. Okay, so it's a selectively permeable membrane. So it only lets certain things in and out, which is basically your oxygen and your carbon dioxide. Now, as with all blood cells, they are produced in the bone marrow. So can you remember, where do we find bone marrow?
In our bones?
Yeah, in our bones. Good. So we should have remembered that from last week. So bone marrow is a specialist sort of substance that allows for making red and white blood cells. So here's a picture of a red blood cell. So it on the right hand side, the measurements that's the size of them. I think that means micromillimeters. That funny, it looks like a cross between an M and a U in front of the other M. So they're really quite tiny. But yeah, you can see the biconcave shape there in the side view, cut in half. So white blood cells are much larger than red blood cells. So they do have a nucleus. So the nucleus is there for, it contains our DNA. It contains information of what the blood cell should be doing. And that's quite an important part. It's like the brain of the cell. So white blood cells are part of our immune system and they protect against microbe entry. So they fight bacteria and viruses and parasites that get into our body, and they also remove waste materials. And they can do this by a process called phagocytosis. So phagocytosis is when these cells, which you can see some examples of them on the right hand side, they basically act a little bit like Pac-Man and chomp and eat any debris found in the blood. So that can be bits of broken cells, it can be bacteria, it can be sort of any bits of debris floating around. They basically eat it up and digest it within inside them. So they're our waste disposal system, really. They get rid of all the rubbish floating around in the blood. Sorry, I've gone back. Platelets. So platelets are fragments of bone of blood cells formed in the bone marrow, and they are involved in blood clotting. And the function of these platelets is to create a cascade effect to help the blood clot, to stop blood leaking out of the body, but most importantly to stop anything coming in. Because when we have an open wound, it's a big old door for anything outside the body to get in and float around in our blood. And remember, the blood goes everywhere. So if there's a bacteria that enters in your finger, it can float around in your blood and go to anywhere in your body and infect it. So it's really quite important that we make sure that we close any gaps as quickly as possible. And that's what the platelets do. So there are four main functions of blood. So we have transportation, defence, regulation and clotting. So I tend to break this down into three, which is transportation, protection, which is the defence and the clotting in together, and then regulation. And it helps me remember TPR. So Tommy plays rugby, transportation, protection and regulation. So if you like to use little I think they're acronyms, are they? Is that what they're called? You can use that to help you remember the functions of the blood. So let's talk a little bit about transportation. So most of you will probably know that red blood cells carry oxygen around the body, so that's the transportation of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Some carbon dioxide is carried in your red blood cells back to the lungs, but a lot of it is dissolved within the fluid of the blood, so into the plasma. So as it comes near to or comes to the lungs, it then exchanges with the oxygen from the outside environment, and this is called gaseous exchange. It transports nutrients such as glucose, vitamins and minerals, proteins, that sort of thing around the body. So they're used to fuel our body, they're used for energy, and they're used in making substances, they're used in the active production of things. So it's quite important that we get this delivery of food via the blood system. Also, it carries hormones. So you probably would have heard people say about hormones, especially sort of around menstruation and periods and teenagers and things like that. But hormones are involved in everything. So hormones are a communication, a type of chemical communication that gets sent to targeted organs around the body. So your growth is to do with hormones. Your what else? So your obviously your menstrual cycle, your repair is to do with hormones. So hormones are the chemical parts of the body that tell bits to do things, really. So that's another really important function. It also transports waste materials. So not only things that shouldn't be in the body, but waste that's made during processes that have to occur in the body. So one of these waste materials is something called urea. So urea is made when cells make things, basically. It's a waste product, and it carries urea to the kidneys to be filtered out and excreted in your urine. Again, this is a really important function, because if we have too much urea in our blood, then basically we become poisoned and we can't function. So it is majorly important that we get rid of it. Oh, sorry, I've done it again. There you go. So defence. So we talked about white blood cells a little bit just a minute ago. So they fight against disease and microbe entry. They engulf the bacteria and destroy them by a process called phagocytosis. That means that those cells are called phagocytes, cyte meaning cell. We also have some blood cells called lymphocytes. They are specialised white blood cells, and they produce antibodies which give the body future resistance to reinfection. So that's all very important at the moment, because that happens with viruses, basically. So when we come in contact with a virus, our lymphocytes produce antibodies which can fight against it, and hopefully our bodies keep some of those antibodies for when we come across that virus again. And that's really how immunisation works. When you are immunised against a virus, you have something put into your body that is that creates this reaction. So it can be a protein from the virus, it can be an inactive part of the virus. There's lots of different mechanisms that do this, but that's basically what they're trying to do. So when you are vaccinated against something, you are trying to stimulate your body's natural defense against the infection, because it's worse to have the infection than it is to have in theory, to have the bit of the virus or whatever inside you, because it's not active, it can't do anything, it can't replicate itself, sometimes it's just a piece of it. So it's hoped that is what's going to be happening with the vaccines to the coronavirus that's coming. If you had the vaccination for the cervical cancer vaccination, that's what they would be doing. Your measles, mumps and rubella vaccination you may have had as a small child does the same thing. So it's basically stimulating your nervous system, your immune system to fight against this disease without you having to actually be in contact with it and causing risk to life. So the blood is used to regulate many things in the body. So one such thing is heat. So we've talked about heat regulation and how the blood helps with that because of the vasodilation of surface capillaries when we get hot, causing erythema. But it also allows the brain to basically test the temperature of the blood of the body. So it has like a little dipstick really that sort of sits in the brain and basically monitors the blood for temperature. So if it becomes too hot, what happens is it sends a signal for the sweat glands to produce sweat. It sends a signal for us to perhaps increase our breathing a little bit. It sends a signal to the erector pili muscles to flatten because we don't want to keep warmth next to the body if we're too hot, and that in turn and it also sends a signal for the vasodilation of the surface capillaries. So that all helps to keep the inside of our body cool. If we don't keep cool, or we don't keep the same temperature, then that is catastrophic. So if we dip too low or we go too high, then the processes that happen in the body every day to help our body function and help us grow and help us process food, etc., won't work, and then we don't work. Does anybody know the ideal temperature, what temperature we should be inside our bodies? Has anybody got any idea?
Isn't it like 30, 34?
No, you almost said it then. That's about 36, 37 degrees, depending on where you are, the person, what's taking the temperature, because temperature on the skin is a little bit different to if you put the temperature in the mouth or rectally. So because that's truer, because that's inside the body. Obviously skin can change slightly. But yeah, between 36 and 37, 34 is a little bit low, and you're getting into sort of a dangerous territory there. And as the same with when your temperature is raised. So if your temperature becomes higher than this, so if 38, 39, 40 degrees, that's really getting to be sort of quite bad. Does anybody know why our temperature raises when we are not very well? Thinking about what I've just said. No?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure.
No one. Okay. So we don't work very well if we're too hot inside. So things don't function very well. But also things that like to live inside us don't function very well when we get hot. So the reason when we are ill or when we have an infection, we have a raised temperature is because we are trying to stop whatever it is inside us from reproducing and stop it from being as effective and functioning. So if we don't work that well, they don't. So bacteria doesn't work very well in a higher temperature. Viruses don't work particularly well in a higher temperature. So this is why when you are ill, your temperature rises. It's not actually the infection that's causing that. It's your body's immune response. So when you take paracetamol and ibuprofen to lower your temperature, it's actually giving the bacteria or virus a better environment to be able to grow. Now, I'm not saying if you're ill, don't take paracetamol or ibuprofen, but in my personal opinion, this is personal now, not a sort of a regulated opinion of the college or anything. So just bear with me with this. In my personal opinion, if your temperature's not that hot that it's dangerous, so if it's raised, I don't know, normal's 37, it's raised to sort of 37.8, 38 degrees, and you can cope with the discomfort, I sometimes think it's better to stick with that higher temperature because it's giving the bacteria or the virus inside you sort of the green light to go ahead and and carry on as normal if you lower it. So that's my thinking around sort of paracetamol and ibuprofen. So I don't tend to take them if I'm not that ill, really. But yeah, that's how it works, because when you take them, they lower your body temperature and they lower the inflammatory response. So actually, these things can work a little bit better. So it's a balance, really, because if you're feeling really rotten, you need to have a bit of pain relief. So, blood also helps to regulate pH. So pH is the acidity alkaline balance in your body. Does anyone have any idea what pH is neutral? Can you remember this?
7.
Yes,
7.
7. Well done. Does anybody have any idea what pH our body should be inside?
Inside, are we meant to be alkaline?
No, actually, we're neutral.
Are we?
Yeah, we're neutral inside. Does anybody know what pH we are on our skin?
Acidy.
Yeah, we're acidic. So we're basically made up of water, and water is sort of alkaline pH. So if we have too much acid in the body, it's not very good for us. And we have something in the lining of some blood vessels in the neck called a chemoreceptor. So a chemoreceptor is something that senses chemical changes in the blood, so the pH. Now, there is something that causes the blood to become acidic. You probably don't know, but does anybody have any idea what makes the blood become acidic?
I don't know.
No? Yeah, that's fine. I didn't think you would. This is quite difficult. So carbon dioxide makes the blood become acidic. And what testing the pH of the blood does is tells us if we need to increase our breathing rate. Because when we take a deep breath in and we use the oxygen in our blood, in our breath, we only actually use about 4% of the oxygen we take in. The rest we breathe back out. And that's why things like CPR work. So when you're blowing into someone, you're trying to sort of save their life, you're not just blowing carbon dioxide into them, you're blowing quite a lot of oxygen as well. So our body doesn't test to see whether we need oxygen in the blood. It tests to see whether we've got too much carbon dioxide. And too much carbon dioxide changes the pH of the blood, and that makes us breathe faster. Get it?
Yeah.
Any questions?
No.
No. Okay. Let's move on. Clotting. Ooh. So, platelets will clot in an area where there is damage. So, if you cut yourself or have an open wound, then the clotting process will start. Now, the trouble is, this doesn't always happen if there is a cut or a break in the blood vessel. It sometimes happens when there isn't. You have these little things called plaques that develop in your blood vessels, and they are, some people think they're related to cholesterol, others think they're related to sugar, but you have these sort of plaques that build up. Now, if your blood pressure is high, or if you smoke, or have other things floating around in your blood, they can sort of knock the head off of these plaques. So when the head becomes sort of knocked off, it makes your body think that there's a open wound in your blood vessels, and what that does is that starts your clotting response. So it's a clotting response when there is nothing to plug it up. So what then happens is the blood vessel becomes plugged, and that's when you have things like deep vein thrombosis, so it's a blood clot, or where blood clots form in small capillaries, arteries and veins in the head, in the brain. It's a stroke, and in the heart it can cause a heart attack. So whilst the clotting mechanism is really brilliant, it stops us from being infected all the time, it helps to stop us losing some blood. Sometimes when our body's inside isn't particularly healthy, it can cause quite catastrophic problems. Blood vessels. So we have three main blood vessels. We have arteries, veins and capillaries. So arteries, here we have a picture. It's not a great picture, but you might be able to see. So I haven't got, my pointer doesn't work on this when I'm doing these presentations, but I would be pointing to it where the centre of that sort of round tube is. So where the arrow is now, where it says movement of blood, that is actually a hole. So this is basically like a hose, really, but the arteries in our hose have really thick muscular elastic walls to allow for high pressure. So if we make the hole smaller and the walls thicker, it allows us to move the blood further along with less effort from the heart. Because remember, the heart's the only thing that's pumping here, and the heart's got to get the blood from our chest to our feet and our toes and our fingers and up into our brain. So it has got a little bit of work to do. Now, arteries carry blood under pressure away from the heart, so that's really important to remember. Arteries away. Most arteries will carry oxygenated blood, except for the pulmonary artery in the heart, which carries deoxygenated blood away from the heart and to the lungs. So arteries don't have valves. So valves are one-way doors that stop backflow of blood, but because arteries are very highly pressured, they don't need it. And you can see the layers of the artery, sort of the thick artery wall around the outside. And then I want you to compare that to veins. So arteries lie deeper than veins. That's why if you were to look at your arm, you could probably see some veins, but you'd never see arteries sort of laying near the surface because of the high pressure. If they're damaged, then we lose a lot of blood very, very quickly. Veins, if you can see, look at the difference in the size. Veins have a really quite a thin wall, so they're not very elastic, they're not very muscular, but they have a really quite big lumen, so that's the centre where the blood is held. So veins don't have the same amount of pressure going through them as arteries, so they do need valves. So the valves are one-way doors and they prevent backflow. So veins carry blood to the heart. They usually carry deoxygenated blood, except for the pulmonary vein. So the pulmonary vein takes oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. Okay? So capillaries are the smallest vessels. They're 1 cell thick. So they join onto the ends of small arteries and veins, and these are neither arteries or veins. They carry a mixture of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, because as soon as the capillary becomes thin enough, it starts to transfer oxygen and carbon dioxide within it to the outside of the artery, to the outside of the capillary. They don't have any valves, and they're basically there for the exchange of gases, the movement of nutrients, and taking anything that needs to get to different parts of the body. It allows it to get out of the blood through the capillaries. So the circulatory system is called circulatory because it goes round and round and round, It's like a massive recycling centre. There isn't a beginning and there's not an end to it. And you can see how this works here. So you've got the artery at the top going through, getting smaller and smaller, going to the size of the capillaries and the capillary network. This then gets, these vessels then get bigger and bigger to create veins, and then they go back. The veins then take the blood to the heart, to the lungs to be oxygenated, and then it becomes oxygenated again, goes through the heart, through the aorta, and then it all starts again. So this all happens through something called capillary exchange. So this is the exchange of the substances between the tissues and the capillaries. So it does this through a process called diffusion. So diffusion is when you have a substance of high concentration moving to an area of low concentration. You might remember that from school, but don't worry too much. You go into that in a little bit more detail at level 3. So the things that are exchanged are oxygen, nutrients, vitamins and minerals, carbon dioxide, waste products. So they're basically exchanged. So when a cell does what it needs to do, it has waste products and it needs to be taken away. So these hang around in the fluid outside of the cell until it's exchanged with the oxygen and nutrients and goodness as it goes near to the capillary. And there's a picture of it happening. So the heart. The heart is made up of cardiac muscle. It is a pump, and it's made up of layers of tissue. So epithelial tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and connective tissue. It maintains constant circulation of blood in the body. If we don't have it circulating, we don't work anymore, unfortunately. And the heart regulates itself, and it speeds up or slows down depending on the amount of blood required by the body, the amount of oxygen required by the body, or the removal of carbon dioxide, should I say. So here we've got a diagram. So we can see up the top we have 2 chambers called atrium or atria when we talk about 2 of them. We have a right and a left. Now if you look at it, it says right, but when you're looking at it, it's on your left. That's because you're looking at someone in front of you. So if someone was stood in front of you, the right side would be your left, basically. So we have, going into the top, we'd start with the right atrium. Going into the top, we have the vena cava. Now the vena cava is the main blood vessel from the body. So there's a superior and an inferior, meaning one at the top, one at the bottom. So one coming from the top of the body, one coming from the lower part of the body. It joins into the right atrium and it goes through a valve which stops backflow called the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. So the right ventricle is a bigger chamber, and this is where all the sort of pushing happens. So you can see around it that dotty tissue is all muscle. So there's quite a lot of muscle around the ventricles, and that's there to push the blood up and out of the vessels at the top. So on the right, it pushes it up through another valve called a semilunar valve and up and out into the pulmonary artery. So remember, the pulmonary artery goes to the lungs. The blood is oxygenated and then it comes back to the heart through the left pulmonary veins. And you can see that on the other side, sort of marked in red, the top chamber. You've got the pulmonary veins coming in to the left atrium. So the left atrium, again, both atria aren't very big. They're quite small, really. They're just an extension of the blood vessels. This then contracts and pushes the blood through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle at the bottom, and all that thick muscular tissue contracts and pushes the blood, the oxygenated blood in the left ventricle, up through the semilunar valve into the aorta. So the aorta is your big main artery that runs from your heart all the way down to basically where your belly button is, and then divides off into the iliac arteries. If you scrunch your fists together and stick your thumb up out the top. That's basically the size of your heart, and your fist, sorry, is the size of your heart, and the thumb sticking out the top is basically the size of your aorta. So it's a really thick, big blood vessel. So the main arteries are the aorta, so this takes oxygenated blood to the body. The pulmonary artery takes deoxygenated blood to the lungs. The main veins are superior and inferior vena cava. This brings oxygenated blood from the body back to the heart, and then the pulmonary vein, or veins, and they bring oxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. So we can see in this diagram here how it all flows. So blood always goes into the atria and out of the ventricles. So, arteries to the head. Now you are going to need to know this for when you do your facial exam, I think, and your makeup exam. That might be in there as well. So the main blood vessel that goes from the heart, or the aorta, sorry, to the head and brain is the carotid artery. So we have a common carotid. Can you see the bottom where it's got the arrow that's pointing to that blood vessel, and it's one blood vessel. You then have it dividing in the centre. So there's two divisions, and you can see that it's got facial artery, occipital artery. So these come off of the two divisions, which aren't labelled on here, and I should have them labelled really, which we have the internal and the external carotid artery. So the internal carotid artery goes into the brain, and the external carotid artery basically goes to the facial area. So veins from the head, so that once the oxygen is used in the head and the brain, it needs to come back to the heart again. So it goes through a vein called the jugular vein, and that is in the neck. So both of these veins basically are in either side of your neck, underneath a muscle called your sternocleidomastoid, which goes from your sort of the side of your head down to your clavicle, which is your collarbone. We don't need to know about the blood shunting. Blood pressure. Blood pressure is the force at which the liquid of the blood presses against the artery walls. So remember, the blood pumps, okay, so, and it has, when you feel your heartbeat, there's sort of a ba-boom. This is the maximum and then minimum pressure pushing on your artery walls. So the maximum pressure is when your heart's contracted and all of your blood is out into your veins and arteries. The minimum pressure is when the heart is relaxed and there's some blood in the heart, so it's taking some of the pressure off the outside. That's why when you have your blood pressure taken, it'll have two numbers. So average blood pressure is 120/80, and anything different to that, you're starting to get into the higher or lower ranges. So things that affect blood pressure are excitement, stress, anger, fright, exercise, pain, smoking and drugs. I'm sure there's something else but I've forgotten to add. I mean, all these things will help to create issues in the cardiovascular system. So something we can help with is stress. Obviously, our facial treatments, manicures, pedicures, when you get onto level 3, your body massage, that sort of thing, can help to relieve stress. It can help to calm things down a little bit. We can advise about exercise, as in getting our clients to try and do a bit of exercise. Also, we can recommend to our clients that they cut down on smoking. Excitement and anger, these things, we do need some stress in our lives. So it is important that we do have some ups and downs. Otherwise, life would just be boring and people wouldn't sort of cope with it. But these are things that we can't really do that much about. Okay. So